Hey, so you'll probably see, I'm going to try to do a little bit more on Instagram stories, a little bit of Q&A, try to get some topics generated for what we'll be talking about here and then in the future on SageSpot. One of the things that I got asked recently was talk more about flexibility. So really open-ended, that means I can get to say whatever I want. Many years ago, I did a talk on really what was mobility. I think the topic was cracking the code of mobility or something like that. And part of where we started with in that talk was using terms and setting definitions. So before I even say the terms, obviously flexibility will be one of them. The definitions that I'm going to use are the ones that are applicable based on the laws of physics. When you talk about words like flexibility or mobility or stability, these are all words that really do live outside of human performance and can be applicable to anything that resides in the space of physical performance, physical properties. Flexibility, mobility, and stability are all words that live in any kind of organic system, or even inorganic, which we'll actually talk about in terms of flexibility. All right, so let's start with that term flexibility, and I will suggest that every substance on Earth has both all of these words, and anything has flexibility. Anything. So it can be a human being that as a whole, but that requires a standard to communicate on is this individual flexible or not. Well, flexibility when it comes to a human requires some kind of standard, but by definition, flexibility is simply contextually related under what kind of environment can this substance change its shape. A piece of wood can change its shape, a human muscle, human fascia, a piece of metal. All of these things have an inherent value of flexibility. If you heat up a piece of metal, it appears to be more flexible because flexibility is always contextual. So to communicate about flexibility and not even have a standard in the human system isn't going to get us very, very far. But anything can be flexible. You could have low flexibility, you put a standard. You could have good or high flexibility, you put a standard. But every substance on Earth has a degree of flexibility. It might change under different circumstances, like we said, but everything is flexible. Part of the standard that at least we use in physical medicine that is very, very similar is range of motion. Range of motion, though, is a standard, a very, very standardized scope of measuring a joint, which can be mitigated by tons of things. It can be mitigated by pain. It can be mitigated by strength. It can be mitigated by different forms of tissue quality. Everything comes into play to say that is this motion, range of motion, where does it fall within measurements made by a goniometer, meaning goniometer, kind of probably people look at it as a funky looking protractor where there's a stable arm and a mobile arm, and then the angle that's created by the joint governing that motion, that's range of motion. If you're not measuring it the way that the standardized organization for most people, that's going to be the American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons. There might be other standards, but let's say you can still use a goniometer and measure range of motion, but it probably could and would be different than if you measured in a different position if a different organization has a standard. Example, measuring glenohumeral joint flexion. And you put the stable arm on the side of the body, down the flank, and you have the mobile arm based on the humerus. The fulcrum, the center of the goniometer goes at wherever you think is the center of the joint. And typically, the accepted range of motion measurement for glenohumeral flexion is done in the sitting position, not the supine position. It doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with measuring motion in the supine position, but now if people are not communicating where the position is, but what else changes in the position. So range of motion gets really, really soggy. It's like English from all across the country, where sometimes people from Maine can't always understand what people in southern Texas are saying, even though they're both still talking English. So range of motion is an attempt to standardize communication, but it's not even practical at times, especially when you then start to add in the differences between active and passive range of motion. So flexibility, anything on earth is flexible. Range of motion, it probably needs to be measured one way and communicated in a very, very even and standard fashion. In my opinion, the better words to communicate about what I think somebody is asking about when it comes to flexibility is mobility and stability. And now, mobility and stability, again, no ability to communicate without a standard. What is good, what is not good, is only what someone else can decide. But this is where people will use words that can generate some magnetism, can generate some attention, and they just change the definitions. And most of the time, the definitions that they're using have utility to the training and rehab process, except they're not the word. It's not the definition that has been determined by the laws of physics. I'm not sure any of us get the opportunity to agree or disagree with the laws of physics. They are exactly what they are, and in the laws of physics, mobility has a definition. Stability has a definition, and it may not always pertain to the human systems, okay? So mobility is when a system is uninfluenced, meaning for us, there is no motor control, there is no strength. It is simply what can the joints do if they were unaffected by any of these human factors. So if we're going to use a machine, the bolts, the natural ability of the bolt to turn loose or tightly is the mobility of the bolt. It doesn't comment on why, if it's too tight. We don't know why. We don't know if we're just not strong enough to move it. We don't know if the bearings are stripped. We have no idea. We just know that the mobility is unacceptable for it to be able to open. The same thing with joints. Joint mobility is neither flexibility nor range of motion. Mobility is simply what can the joints do without the nervous system's impact? What is the current snapshot of the quality of all things related to the joint, and can they move? Now, once you evaluate if mobility is unacceptable, then it might be the joint. It could be the capsule. It could be the single joint muscles. It can be the double joint muscles. It could be fascia. Whatever techniques that you look to utilize, then you just remeasure the joint however you see fit. Now, how do we know what's good mobility? Can the joint get into the position that you want in your training or rehab? Because if the joint can't get into position under any circumstances, at best, you're going to have a mitigated response. At worst, you'll hurt the person. So mobility is crucial, and you must start with mobility before you get to the next step of motion that we are describing, which is stability. Stability is very simple: control in the presence of change. Can you control under some circumstance? Doesn't even mean it's a good idea to control. Sometimes you can control by jamming joints together. Sometimes you can control by tensioning capsules or two joint tendons. So now there is an inherent control of maintaining that joint in place. We can arch really, really hard and throw your neck back when you squat. Maybe you can get more wheels on the bar and 3 white lights. That is clearly a form of stability, and one that will likely have undesirable effects down the road. You have a significantly high performance effect. That's a whole nother story on where I think the top end of your training or performance can go. But the bottom line is using strategies that are muscular, using strategies that are centrated, probably have a much more desirable long-term response, probably have a bigger upside for performance, but they're no more or less stable than where you're jamming joints together and tensioning capsules. So you can only be stable, though, within the motion that you have. So this is where we would probably be ideal to look don't look at the joints first. Number one, if you're looking at the joints first, pretty much every joint should be measured under the same circumstances, whether it's with or without gravity, active versus passive. You can't just do some lying down and some sitting. So that's why you don't even bother. Look at basic movements, body weight, single repetition, so there's no fatigue that's confounding what you're seeing. There's no strength limitations or some kind of work capacity limitation to confound what you're seeing. And then if they can do what you want to do and those joint angles relate to your training, you don't have a mobility or a flexibility problem. You might have a stability problem when you add more weight, but we're eliminating these basic fundamental movement characteristics. This is really where you can start to compartmentalize these definitions. And if these definitions existed for a long, long time and they weren't the problem, what I think happened was people kept hearing the word stability and thought it was a hard plank, or a stable is one thing. Stable can be anything. There might be a desirable training impact, there might be an undesirable training impact. But stability is just control in the presence of change. That you could have, again, good or not good stability. The standards that people want to use, that's where you get to choose. But to turn around the definitions and literally make a concerted attempt to confuse people and violate the standards of physics, man. And the hard part is a lot of times people mangle the definitions, but the training model behind it is still very, very solid and very, very scientific. But I think there's a significant confusion when someone asks about flexibility. It might be because some people just decided to change the definitions of mobility and stability just because they felt like it and they wanted to be different. I don't think it's necessary to change the fundamental definitions. We can be different by having more effective or more expedient training models that actually create desirable impacts and desirable adaptations. So, number one, everything on Earth has flexibility. It's going to change under different circumstances depending on the substances. Can you actually change the shape of said product, said organic or inorganic substance? You might need a whole lot of force. The stress-strain curve every substance on Earth has its own stress-strain curve. That's flexibility. Range of motion is one goniometric measure that is measuring one thing in one way and communicated across the board with the exact same language. Mobility and stability are far more functional, maybe meaning purposeful. They're always going to be communicated against the quality of a standard mobility. What can the joint system do with zero central nervous system impact? And that is consistent with how physics would communicate or define mobility. Stability, control of the amount of mobility that you possess, control in the presence of change. So when somebody asks me to talk about flexibility, that's my first answer. That's where that webinar, Cracking the Code, started. And maybe we'll get into some more things if there's more questions that come about. So last thing, as always, if anybody's seen a leprechaun, say yeah.